Field artillery in the war between the states was primarily an anti-personnel weapon. The most popular field artillery piece on both sides during the war was the 12-pound Napoleon. It was light enough to be maneuvered as a field artillery piece, yet fired full-charge 12-pound ammunition. This ammunition consisted of 4 major types of projectiles. Solid or round shot was a solid iron ball. Like all other projectiles, it was attached to a wooden sabot by metal bands. The sabot improved the accuracy and served double duty by having a woolen powder bag attached to it. This meant that when loading, the powder charge, sabot, and projectile were all one piece and could be loaded with one stroke. Shell was a hollow iron ball filled with black powder and using a Borman or similar type of fuse. The fuse was a wooden plug containing a powder train in a groove. The cover was a scale graduated in seconds. The gunner estimated the range and consequent time of flight to the target and called out the number. The fuse cutter cut a hole in the fuse cover at the appropriate mark. Hopefully, the powder gases escaping past the projectile would ignite the fuse, which would burn for the required number of seconds before causing the projectile to explode. This was a very iffy thing. Problems with fuses, range estimation, and variations in muzzle velocity made it near impossible to get the projectile to explode in the right place. Spherical case was the same as shell, except that the hollow area in the shell contained a very small burster charge and a number of separate iron balls. Grape or canister shot was used on infantry at less than 400 yards. This collection of small iron balls converted the Napoleon into a giant shotgun. When the infantry closed to within 180 yards, one powder charge could be loaded with 2 containers of canister, thereby doubling the number of projectiles to 24 pounds. Explosive shell and spherical case had little bursting power and were unreliable. The preferred rounds were solid shot and canister. I am sure you expected the canister shot to be impressive, but the round shot was surprising. They bounced through the formation like a bowling ball gone berserk. Every strike upon the ground and every impact with a target created secondary projectiles which traveled through the target area at odd angles. Wartime stories of round shot hurling rifled muskets, canteens, and pieces of bodies as secondary projectiles are true. One can only imagine what it must have looked like when a battery of 6 of these were on line firing at maximum rate. During the war, maximum rate for these weapons was 4 rounds per minute. This is faster than we were firing, since we put a premium on safety and intentionally went slowly. By calculating the rate of advance of infantry using Hardee's manual and comparing this to the rate of fire, we find that an infantry unit attacking a Napoleon field piece from 1,500 yards out would, by the time they arrived at the gun, receive 676 pounds of round shot and canister from that single field piece alone. This brings up 2 important side points: Gatling guns and leadership. The Gatling gun of the war between the states was the size of this field piece, yet its combat range was exactly the same as the rifled musket. Since cartridge cases were not yet practical, Gatling gun crews had to load and prime steel sleeves as if those sleeves were .58 caliber rifled muskets. These sleeves were then fed into the gun as ammunition. After every couple of hundred rounds, they had to cease fire to reload the sleeves and clean out the vast quantities of powder fouling which escaped past the gap between sleeve and barrel. No one in his right mind would pick a Gatling gun over any smoothbore field piece. With Napoleon's belching death, Why did men go forward? They were led from the front. During the war between the states, over 160 general officers from both sides were killed. All but one or two were killed leading their men in battle from the front. This is far in excess of all general officer casualties of the United States in all other wars combined. Despite the death and destruction, soldiers of both sides went forward to their job. At the Battle of Newmarket, for example, the Corps of Cadets from the Virginia Military Institute went on line near the Bushong House and charged. They crossed this field from the Bushong House to where you are standing, approximately 600 yards, and the location of a federal battery. They not only seized the battery, they actually broke the Union line asunder, putting it to flight. The price they paid for moving across that short space of ground, some of which was dead space in which they were protected from fire, was 10 dead and 45 wounded out of 222 total engaged. I have some recovered targets. These shot with canister shot. And these hit with round shot. When you study the war, remember these targets and the range film. They will give you a new dimension on the peculiar problems of that war and the courage of the troops involved. Was the 12-pound Napoleon effective? Yes. Its canister at close range and round shot at long range was deadly. You can imagine what would happen to soldiers hit with the round shot as these targets were hit. It was not uncommon to see sights such as this: a soldier whose abdomen has been carried away and whose left hand and forearm was severed from his body by round shot. Damage is likewise increased when bone or equipment is hit, as bone chips and equipment fragments are driven through the body as secondary projectiles. The cans do, however, illustrate a historical point. The last 200 years has seen a great improvement in volume of fire and combat range. There has been no parallel increase in terminal effect. The surgeons and coroners of today frequently write about the tertiary shattering of bone that radiates from the impact point when struck with a high-velocity, close-range hit with 5.56 millimeter or 22 caliber, or a tumbling hit from 7.62 millimeter or 30 caliber. This is exactly the same effect as the surgeons of yesterday wrote about in the war between the states with the 58 caliber mini ball, or in the American Revolution with the round ball. Today, if hit in an extremity, you are relatively lucky, for a surgeon can transplant marrow, pin the bone, put you in traction, and save your arm or leg. In the war between the states, for example, that medical knowledge and skill simply wasn't there. When bone in a limb was hit, that limb was normally amputated. Surgeons' kits resembled a cross between medieval instruments of torture and a carpenter's toolbox. Aid stations resembled butcher shops. We bemoan the 600,000 plus dead of the war between the states, while forgetting the 500,000 more who lost one or more limbs through amputation. You should also remember that anesthesia was in its infancy Before the war between the states, and sometimes during it, the patient was awake while the cutting was done. The only painkillers during recovery after the amputation were alcohol, heroin, and opium. The flintlock smoothbore musket reigned supreme on the battlefield from roughly 1700 to 1855. It was supplanted by the rifled musket, which was an outgrowth of two major developments. The first was percussion priming, which I'll cover in a few minutes. The second was the practical harnessing of rifling for general military use. If you have seen before, a rifled barrel has spiral grooves cut in the bore. The high spots are called lands, and the diameter from the land on one side to the land on the other side is called bore diameter. The diameter from the bottom of the groove on one side to the bottom of the groove on the other side is called groove diameter. The lands cut notches in the side of the bullet, thereby imparting spin. Therefore, the bullet must be groove diameter in order to be spun. But if the bullet is groove diameter, then you can't load it from the muzzle because the bullet won't easily pass through the barrel. In the Kentucky rifle, this was solved by using a ball slightly under bore diameter but held in a cloth patch. This was simply not militarily practical. In the 1830s, a number of methods were tried to circumvent this problem. The most popular and successful was the mini ball. This bullet was made of soft lead and was slightly less than bore diameter for ease in loading. Its base was hollow, and when the propellant gases pushed the bullet forward, they also went into the hollow in the base and expanded the side walls of the bullet into the barrel grooves, thereby engraving the rifling on the bullet and imparting spin. In addition, this also obturated or sealed the powder gases behind the bullet, giving a slightly higher muzzle velocity. Grease was placed in the grooves along the side of the bullet, first to ease passage of the bullet down the bore when loading, and secondly to keep the powder fouling in the barrel soft so that the bullet skirts could scrape some of the fouling out from shot to shot. Lastly, the bullet was conical in shape, and though no one was really thinking of it yet, this greatly increased aerodynamic efficiency over the old round ball. Thanks primarily to the spin imparted to the conical projectile, the rifled musket was much more accurate than the smoothbore. I have two demonstration targets here to illustrate this. One was fired with a Brown Bess, the other with a rifled musket. Both weapons were fired from a rest so as to eliminate as much as possible all variables except the accuracy of the weapon. 5 shots were fired at each target from a range of 80 yards. You can see that only 2 hits were made with the Brown Bess, while a respectable group was made with the rifled musket. It was this increase in combat range which had such a terrible effect upon that war. You have probably heard the slogan that the war between the states was a war fought with 20th century weapons and 18th century tactics. This statement is simplistic rubbish. It, in fact, was a 19th century war fought with a very peculiar set of 19th century problems. The soldier had to remain bolt upright and stationary in order to load his weapon. He had to remain in a tight formation in order to gain a great enough volume of fire to stop a massed enemy charge. But when he stood to load his rifled musket, he became an inviting target for the rifled muskets of the other side. The generals of the day had gained their experience in the Mexican War, which was fought with smoothbore muskets. The new capability of the rifled musket was something they had never experienced. There was some effort to prepare the leaders, but it didn't work out properly. In 1854, a number of competing systems, the mini ball being one of them, were tested in the United States by Colonel Benjamin Huger. His report recommended the adoption of the mini system and was submitted to then Secretary of War Jefferson Davis. To make a long story short, the rifled musket was adopted in 1855, and William Hardee was instructed to modify the drill manuals of the Army in order to account for the new capabilities of the rifled musket. Hardee's solution was to keep the drill basically the same, but by increasing the length of the pace or stride and the number of paces per minute, he had the soldiers cover ground approximately twice as fast as they had under the old drill. Given the emphasis on drill throughout the preceding 150 years, Hardee's new tactics received a great deal of attention and discussion as officers and leaders busied themselves with it. Captain Henry Heff recognized that the greater accuracy of the rifled musket would require different training for the soldier, particularly in the field of marksmanship. He created an entire marksmanship system to include awards for competency. Though portions of it were adopted, it received relatively little attention. In effect, the leaders were starting off brand new. Some worked on solutions to the paradox of being hit by the enemy's rifled muskets when you attempted to load your own. Tactically, both General Forrest of the Confederate States Army and General Smith of the United States Army came up with solutions that looked remarkably similar to the tactics of fire and maneuver and fire and movement that had been in great vogue in the last 30 or 40 years. Most of the other generals, especially by the end of the war, had learned the value of field entrenchments. In fact, by the end of the war, especially at places like Petersburg, the war between the states resembled the trench warfare of World War I. For example, Robert E. Lee's nickname was the King of Spades. He got this nickname from his insistence that his men dig in, not from any weakness for card playing. During that war, the earliest known written orders to dig in order to reduce vulnerability to enemy fire, were issued on the 1st of May, 1863, by General Lee to his forces which held the Union Army in check at Chancellorsville while Jackson's men snuck around their flank. At the Battle of Fredericksburg, Union troops created the concept of dog tags. They wrote their name and address on bits of paper pinned to the back of their shirts, for they knew when they went forward to attack that they weren't coming back. By 1864, there were many recorded instances of veterans simply refusing to attack over open ground in the face of rifled musket fire. By the same token, these veterans needed little urging in order to dig in. In a short period of time, they would have hasty entrenchments such as these at New Hope Church in Georgia. Left for a few days, they would rapidly improve their system of defensive earthworks to include cleared fields of fire and obstacles such as this system at Atlanta. Photographs of the dead of the war between the states, particularly those in the vicinity of Fort Mahone at the siege of Petersburg, support what you saw a few moments ago on the range. The cinder block parapet represented the earthworks. The evidence does suggest that, when in defensive earthworks, the soldiers of both sides drew their bayonet, placed it in the ground, and used this as a rest for their ramrod rather than return the ramrod underneath the barrel after every shot. I might add here that you should not assume all generals in the war between the states were fast learners. For example, General Orders Number 36, 7 March of 1864, from General Hood's headquarters, read, in part, "The history of the war abundantly proves that they have never repulsed a determined and well-sustained charge." I'm not sure what war General Hood was talking about, but I'm pretty sure about what he might have been smoking. Perhaps General Hood was unbalanced by his loss of an arm and a leg due to war wounds. Hood would later destroy his army by hurling it against Union earthworks in the Franklin-Nashville campaign. Given the very long combat range of the rifled musket, it is obvious that the defense was the stronger form of combat, but the war still had to be won. The North still had to invade and conquer the South. By May of 1864, the North had adopted the strategy of attrition, whereby they would advance on all fronts because they knew they could replace their casualties while the South could not replace theirs. Even though many generals had begun to learn through 1862 and 63 about the power of the rifled musket, in 1864 and 65, both sides, North and South, found their armies locked in titanic struggles where men were consumed in large quantity. By the middle of 1865, it was over. The South had been bled to death, not in some war with 20th century weapons and 18th century tactics, but in a 19th century war with a peculiar set of 19th century problems and some serious and intelligent men on both sides trying to find a solution. The final result was probably not what anybody had either foreseen or hoped for.